Welcome to the Arab Reforms Initiative inaugural conference on environmental politics in the Middle East and North Africa. I am Ikel Movement. I am a research fellow at ARI based in Tunis. I'm very happy to be moderating this panel in which we will be discussing mobilizations for the environment, activism, and resistance. This is our last panel today, but the conference continues tomorrow, starting at 2 p.m. Central European Time, with two panels: environmentalism from below, local politics and global challenges, environment in conflict, ecologies of war and occupation. Before we begin, I'd like to remind the audience that Arabic interpretation is available on Zoom, and English interpretation is available as well if there will be a presentation in Arabic. We will hopefully have 30 questions of Q&A. You can send us your questions through the Q&A box on Zoom. You can also send questions on Facebook if you're following the Facebook Live. So on the panel, there is a growing and increasingly vibrant activism in MENA around environmental issues, from protests over land use in Egypt to garbage handling in Lebanon, to water mismanagement in Basra, to phosphate pollution in toxic landfills in Tunisia. We have witnessed the rise of ad hoc environmental activism campaigns, as well as more organized social movements born out of environmental harm. Civil society organizations are also more active on the environment, their members campaigning at home and representing the region more regularly and visibly at international meetings on environmental causes. However, environmental activism has yet to be studied in the context of a broader process of social contestation seeking to change the region's political, economic order. What role does environmental activism play in the context of a broader process of social contestation seeking to change the region's political and economic order? Who are the main actors involved? What are the principal modes of actions and strategies? What are the current needs? Where is change most necessary, most possible? This roundtable brings together protagonists and first-hand observers of mobilization from environmental justice in 4 North African countries. The Arab Reform Initiatives works to highlight the various forms, demands, and expressions of environmental activism, understand its organization and current needs, document state responses. One of our priorities is to link and strengthen networks across social movements and countries, as well as between activists and researchers, which is why we are very, very pleased to welcome with us this afternoon our 3 panelists, hopefully 4, if Sami Bahri comes. He has an emergency, so hopefully he'll come at some point. So first we have Hamza Hamouchene. He's an Algerian activist and researcher. Hamza is a London-based Algerian researcher, commentator, and a founding member of Algeria's Solidarity Campaign and Environmental Justice North Africa. He worked on issues of extractivism, resources, land and food sovereignty, and climate, as well as climate, environmental and trade justice. He's the author and editor of 2 books, The Struggle for Energy Democracy in the Maghreb and The Coming Revolution to North Africa, The Struggle for Climate Justice. We also have the pleasure of having with us Soraya El Kahlaoui, Moroccan activist and researcher. Soraya is a postdoctoral researcher at the Middle East and North Africa Research Group at Ghent University in Belgium. She directed the documentary Landless Moroccans. She's also the author of a PhD thesis called To Own, State Building and Resistance to the Mechanism of Dispossession in post-2011 Morocco. Finally, we have with us Aziza Munir, who is from Egypt and who is an environmental politics researcher. Aziza holds a PhD in environmental politics from Freiburg University in Germany. Currently, she works as a Fulbright visiting scholar at the Department of Political Sciences in New Hampshire University. Her current research project focuses on the discourses of environmental movements that erupted in the MENA region in the wake of the Arab Spring. In particular, she investigates how these movements could be sites for knowledge production about how nature culture are organically linked in the everyday struggle of the masses, and how environmental justice has become to the forefront of public sphere in the global south. So thank you everyone for coming to this talk. I'm really happy to be with you to discuss activism and the environment in the in North Africa for once. So I guess we'll start with Hamza, and then Soraya and Aziza, and each of you has maximum 15 minutes for your presentations. I think Hamza, you have slides, so you might want to share your file if you can.
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks, Malek, for the
Go
introduction.
ahead.
And thanks for the Arab Reform Initiative for inviting me to speak on this panel. The title of my presentation today is Fighting for Environmental Justice in North Africa with a kind of a focus on Algeria. But before I go into tackling environmental activism in the region, or what I prefer calling socio-environmental or socio-ecological struggles and conflicts, I'd like just to point out that all I'm going to say today has been documented in a study that I published for the Transnational Institute called Extractivism and Resistance in North Africa. That publication was the outcome of several years of looking into socio-environmental struggles in the region and a kind of a reframing of the environmental question in the sense of repoliticizing it to touch on issues of class, redistributive justice, popular sovereignty, and what do we mean by development in the region. So the ecological crisis in the region finds its clear expression in acute environmental degradation, land exhaustion, the loss of soil fertility, water poverty, pollution, and diseases, as well as the effects of the climate change, such as the recurrent heat waves, droughts, desertifications, and rising sea levels. Of course, this crisis intersects with other crises, such as the food and socio-economic crisis. So how do we apprehend that ecological or environmental crisis in the region? For me, it is not possible to talk about it without grappling with the extractivist development model that has been imposed by imperialism since colonial times. So what is extractivism? Extractivism has been a mode of appropriation and accumulation that has been unleashed all over the planet since 1492 with the conquest of the Americas, with the plunder of gold and silver. So you can imagine that this process has been shaped in violence, in plunder, in slavery, and brutal exploitation. In the North African region, that process has been shaped in the colonial period since the 19th century. Extractivism refers to those activities that extract large quantities of natural resources that are not processed or processed to a certain degree, mainly for export. It is not just present in the mineral or oil sector. It can be found in farming and agriculture, in forestry, in fishing, and even in tourism with its intensive water use. And actually, I was appalled to see the construction of golf courses in arid and semi-arid regions in southern Morocco. And I think Fanon has been right all along when he was describing tourism as a quintessential colonial industry, where our elites, organize parties for their Western counterparts in the midst of overwhelming poverty. So the Maghreb region plays a geostrategic role when it comes to the extractive sector due to its proximity to Europe and the richness of its soil. Algeria is the third largest provider of gas to the European Union, while Tunisia and Morocco play an important role in the production of phosphates that are used as agricultural fertilizers to feed agrarian capitalism. Moreover, Tunisia and Morocco export considerable quantities of agricultural produce into Europe. The strategic importance is reflected in the North or Europe attempts to control these resources through political, military, and economic pressures. One of those tools or ways of controlling this is the negotiations of trade agreements. Despite the halting of the negotiations with Tunisia and Morocco for the time being, European Union has been pursuing the deep and comprehensive trade agreement, or what is called ALECA in Tunisia. And it is a way for controlling these resources. And that extractivist drive did not see a halt or slowing in the last decade. In the contrary, it has been intensified in the North African region, where we see projects of fracking and offshore drilling, as well as the escalation of industrial fishing and agribusiness. And finally, when we talk about extractivism, we cannot disentangle it from the global war machinations and the militarist governance of the world. And in this case, Iraq and Libya warrant more attention, as they are the victims of the violence caused by fossil fuels and the Western fighter jets and bombs that go searching for their abundance. So alongside pollution, environmental destruction, the prevalence of diseases, I've seen throughout my visits to extractive sites in the Maghreb, mainly Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, what David Harvey calls the accumulation by dispossession, and what Samir Amin describes as development of underdevelopment. And I think it's safe to say that the poverty and the underdevelopment in those regions is linked to the presence of significant amounts of natural resources in those areas. And this is the paradox of extractivism, where sacrifice zones with sacrificial people are created in order to maintain the accumulation of capital. And when I say sacrifice zone, I really mean it. For example, Ain Saleh in Algeria is a very rich gas town, one of the richest actually in the African continent, but it has a very poor infrastructure. The only hospital that they have, they call the hospital of death. And the situation is similar with other countries and other parts in North Africa. So basically, we reach the conclusion that extractivism is largely incompatible with social justice due to its disastrous social and environmental consequences. We see poverty, unemployment, dumped poisons, resource pillaging taking place in areas rich in natural resources. And who are the people who are mostly impacted by this? It is the rural working poor and the unemployed in North Africa, comprising small-scale farmers, near-landless rural workers, fisher folks, and the unemployed. I have been asked to focus on Algeria, so I'm going to give a few examples, concrete examples of the socio-environmental conflicts and struggles. So when we talk about Algeria and its natural resources, and in that matter of any country in the region or in the global south in general, we need to bear in mind something, which is the subordinate position in which those countries are inserted into the global capitalist economy in the unjust framework of international division of labor. On the one hand, as a market for the dominant Western economies, and on the other as a reservoir of cheap labor and natural resources. And in this sense, we've seen how aggressive the attempts by the EU to grab more Algerian and Libyan gas. And the EU foreign policy aims to lock North African natural gas as well as renewable energy into the European grid, and is heavily influenced by arms and corporate interests. As I said, Algeria is the third largest source of gas imports to the EU, accounting for 13% of gas imports and 10% of total consumption. The fossil fuel infrastructure is very good. Algeria has 3 pipelines linking it to Europe, one through Tunisia, one through Morocco, and another one directly to Spain. There is even talk of building another one through Italy, but I don't think the funding has been secured. All of this is taking place in a climate of rentier, authoritarian, and a corrupt system that perpetuates Algeria's dependency on fossil fuels. But this state of affairs sparks resistance and protest. And we've seen an escalation of those protests and social movements in the last decades, especially in the last 7-8 years, with the unemployed movements in the Sahara and the anti-fracking movement. I'm going to talk about that later on. In a way, these movements are an insurrection by the victims of fossil capitalism, of extractivism, and their logics of exploitation and plunder. So when it comes to shale gas, in 2015, there was a proper uprisings in the Algerian desert, in the Sahara, by tens of thousands of people, men and women, young and old, including students, rising to protect their water and livelihoods. At the time, Algeria was said to be the third largest shale gas reserves in the world after China and Argentina. And this is according to the US Energy and Information Administration. And I remember that before the Algerian government announced the first fracking test, that was December 2014, that in 2013, France banned its companies, including Total, from fracking on its own territories. But at that time, the then president, François Hollande, and his foreign minister, Fabius, were offering diplomatic supports to those companies to go and frack in Algeria, their former colony. So if this is not energy colonialism and environmental racism, I don't know what it is. And I said extractivism is violence. Extractivism is about normalizing and profiting from violence. Already in the 90s, at the time of a civilian war or a war against civilians, where more than 200,000 people lost their lives and tens of thousands of people disappeared, we've seen a kind of a shock therapy, forced economic liberalization and structural adjustment programs by the IMF and the World Bank, and at the same time, a scramble for oil, gas, and influence. Just 3 years after the military coup, the British company BP finalized the contract worth $3 billion, giving it the right to exploit gas deposit in Ain Saleh in the Sahara for 30 years. And similar deals were achieved by Total and the American firm Arco. And in November 1996, a new pipeline supplying gas to the EU was opened, connecting it through Spain and Portugal. So all these companies and the European Union had an interest in making sure that the regime at that time did not go under. They favored their economic extractive interests and acquiesced to the Algerian regime's dirty war, and that constitute energy grabs. So in front of that predatory model of development, people resist, people rise, people protest, people demand redistributive justice, people demand development, people try to protect their natural resources, people fight the despoliation of their land and the destruction of their livelihoods. So in all those struggles that I'm talking about, there is always an ecological or an environmental element, but it is secondary to more pressing socio-economic questions, such as development, redistribution of wealth, and jobs and decent livelihoods. So the people's environmentalism is not so much about the conservation of exotic species or pristine nature. It is rather a quest for environmental and social justice and a fight against social exclusion, the violence and authoritarianism of neoliberalism and its elites. So I'm coming here to some characteristics of social movements. Those anti-extractivist, or let's say to a certain extent, social movements, for me are not predominantly environmental movements, but they are better understood as the latest development in the historical trajectory of class struggle against capitalist exploitation and imperialist domination in the region. Because they tend to be ephemeral, localized and lack some solid organizational structure, some people questioned the call of social movement and said, maybe we should call them social mobilizations, because the struggle is always defensive and is not offensive. It's true, it's making it hard for capital to accumulate while begging for some crumbs from the pie. When these crumbs are provided, those movements often disintegrate and disappear. And this happened for the unemployed movement in Algeria. When they got some jobs, basically that movement dissipated. And those jobs, not necessarily in the oil sector, but they got jobs in the security forces as well. The other thing that worth talking about is the question of demanding jobs in a destructive, extractive sector. The extractive sector is capital intensive, does not really offer a lot of jobs, and this situation tends to be amplified with the evolving technology. As a result, those jobs that people or local residents are asking for do not materialize, while the promised infrastructure and service are not there. So as that question of demanding jobs, specifically in those industries, has been a thorny issue within communities and social movements, because employment generation and environmental issues are both pressing. So ultimately, these movements are in a sense anti-systemic and anti-hegemonic, and in certain extents, they voice some anti-imperialist demands. These mobilizations bring the internal contradiction of extractivism and capitalism into the open, this helping to forge the class consciousness necessary to overthrow that system and put the sustainable alternatives in its place. So, however, the battles of social movements and rural communities can only be won if they are transformed into fight against capitalism and imperialism in an anti-systemic way, and if they go beyond the local to reach the national, regional, and international levels. I think I'll stop here. Maybe we can discuss the alternatives later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamza. It was really super interesting. So now I think it's Soraya.
Yeah. I have a PowerPoint also. So yeah, where is it? Just a minute. Trying to share, but it doesn't appear. Maybe I have to open it before. It's been 2 years on Zoom and I'm still not good at it.
Yeah, don't worry, you're not alone in this.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay, can I do it from here? Oh, this is the end. Okay. So thank you everyone, and thank you Hamza for your interesting presentation that also opened the discussion for mine. So I'm actually and currently working on land and house struggle in North Africa, so basically on Morocco and Tunisia. But in this presentation, I will mostly focus on Morocco, but feel free in the question, or maybe I can open it also in the conclusion on Tunisia to ask also a question in similar issue in Tunisia. So what I will try to point, it's to show that the question of dispossession is really a key to understand the actual struggle in North Africa, and especially in Morocco after 2011. And I'm sure that it was also before 2011, of course, but I will focus on after 2011. The thing is, why I'm saying that, it's because as you said, Malak, there is not really a big socio-ecological movement organized in Morocco, for example, as we can see in Europe with the Extinction Rebellion, for example, but that does it doesn't mean that that this kind of struggle does not exist in Morocco, and in the opposite, it does exist, but it's structured in a different way. So what I want to show again, it's how dispossession has been politicized in Morocco by the margin after 2011. So, and also what I will do in this presentation, it's to try to build a bridge between the urban and the rural, and try to make a link between the informal housing and land eviction in the question of dispossession, because for me, we have to take land and housing struggle together in order to understand dispossession in the region. So in 2011 in Morocco, we all basically heard how Morocco was good in doing like this democracy by the top, with the king changing the constitution, having the new free election that led the first opposition party, the PJD, at the head of the government. But it's less known that actually in 2012, a rumor has spread that it was said that al-bnit tatlaq, so the construction was completely free, and a lot of informal housing, but also street vendor took place in big city or in the periphery on big city. This picture, it's in Douar Lota, it's in Birdjid. Birdjid, it's a small city in the big periphery of Casablanca, one of the biggest city of Morocco. And what is interesting in this, it's to see that just after this rumor, like 2 or 3 months after, like in March 2012, the local authority tried to stop the informal housing, but a lot of riot took place in all of this kind of neighborhood, and people were really claiming the right of a right to housing, and keep on building. That's what until 2013, and at the beginning of what I call, but I think we can all call it that way, the counter-revolution, also with what happened in Libya and in Syria and also in Egypt, the Moroccan state began to be like very more strong, and started to do what he was doing, what it was doing before 2011, and to facilitate land grabbing and eviction to the private sector. So this is a picture of in 2014 of a tribe that they were in Rabat, Guiche Loudaya, and they were evicted from their collective land in 2014 without any compensation. They are still living in the street today. This tribe was actually living in farming land, so they were farmers in the heart of Rabat, and now all the land are took by a big project to build like a residential area. And so in 2014, I followed particularly this struggle of the Guiche Loudaya tribe, but actually there was a lot of eviction taking place at the very same time in the outskirts of Rabat, also in Douar Speta, but also in Rabat, in Casablanca, for example, in slums. Several examples like Carrière Centrale, one of the most old slum in Casablanca was evicted, but also the Wakrimet and a lot of other examples. So in 2014, there were very actually multiple little struggle, but not organized in a big movement around land or house eviction. But there was one movement in the southeastern of Morocco called Ikel Movement, and it's in a village in the southeastern of Morocco. People, and Hamza talked about it, they were struggling for the right of water against Managem, which is the mining company, the biggest mining company actually in Africa. What is very interesting, it's that the Ikel movement was also one of the first movement who tried to structure the question of land and resources around, for example, several conferences or workshop or meetings around the question of land, and trying to make contact through, for example, the Amazigh movement, but also with the left, to try to make contact with other struggles that are involved in this kind of issue of land or resources. And of course, Hamza can talk about it more, because he initiated a caravan in Tunisia, and one of the activists of Ikel went to Tunisia, for example, also to connect with other struggle very linked to extractivism, the question of resources and land. And what is very interesting for me and to show, it's that all this very small scale movement, and Ikel, who was like bigger and more structured than the Gish Ludeya struggle or Duwars Beta or this kind of struggle around land or housing, led in a way, not directly of course, to the complete explosion of the Herak of the Reef protest in 2016 in the Reef, so in the north of Morocco, after the death of Mohsin Fikri, who was a fishmonger crushed by local authority while he was trying to get back his how to say in English, his fish, anyway. And after that, like the big protest of the Herak of the Reef completely exploded in Morocco for like more than 1 year. In May 2017, like more than 1,000 people were arrested. The leaders of the Herak of the Reef were sentenced to more than 20 years of jail. So we are talking about a big movement, but also that faces a lot of repression. And what is interesting in the Herak of the Reef, in my sense, it's that contrary to what we usually read about how we analyze the question of the Herak of the Reef, because a lot of experts, but even also in the left, for example, they focus on the fact that people were asking for hospital and university and frame all of that through the question of neoliberalism. But when you take the what we call Milif al-Matlabi, so the claims of the Herak of the Reef, we can see that actually most of 20% of the claims are very linked to resources and to land, and very specifically also tackle the question of how our state is still a continuity of the colonial legacy of land grabbing and resources. So this is very interesting for me to see also that this very movement politicized actually very in a very radical way the question of dispossession in Morocco, because it linked the question of dispossession in Morocco to our political system, and not only to our current political system, but also linked it to the colonial past, and really makes a very good link between the post-colonial legacy of our state. And we can see, and for me that's not a surprise to see, that actually even in the demonstration in this picture you can see the Amazigh flag that was predominant in the demonstration of the Herak of the Reef, and also there were also the Reef flag. So also we can see how much it was radical to talk about dispossession, that led also the protester to raise the Amazigh flag and not the Moroccan one. And just in order to conclude, just after after the Herak of the Reef, and despite all this repression, and also the repression of another movement of the Herak of Jrada, that is very linked also to extractivism, a movement called Ikel Movement, Ikel that means land in Amazigh, took place in Morocco, and it's the first organized movement for the right to land organized in Morocco. So it was coordinated by several coordination in all Morocco. This is a demonstration in Casablanca, and you can again see that the Amazigh flag is really predominant. We can see only one Moroccan flag actually in the demonstration. And so we can see how much, again, the question of land is very linked also to the question of the identity and the identity of the state. And for the first time, we have, thanks to Ikel Movement, a movement that completely explicitly asked to the abrogation of all the colonial laws that regulates land, so collective land today, and also resources, so through forest, basically. So yeah, I think I will end here and leave it, yeah. And
okay, thank you very much, Soraya. That was really great. I hope we will talk about Tunisia a bit later in the questions, since Sam is not here. So next we have Aziza Munir. Thank you for coming, and please can go ahead.
Hello, it's my pleasure being here. Thank you for the kind invitation, and I'm really happy being introduced to this fantastic research community and listening to your own presentation and inputs and learning from you. So my presentation today will be about environmental movements in post-Arab Spring, and how these movements can tell us about the current political and social transformation that are taking place in the region. I will start my presentation. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I will give like a talk. I will start my talk giving you a brief overview about the current environmental situation in the MENA region, and then I will give you some examples of the environmental movements that take place in the region in the wake of the Arab Spring, and then I will end my presentation with concluding remarks about what we can learn from these movements, and what so significant about these movements that is related to the political, social, economic transformation in the region. So the MENA region has or face major environmental threats. Their geography and arid and semi-arid climatic conditions have led to a concentration of people on coastal zones and little valleys, with ensuing environmental pollution, declining per capita water resources, increasing soil erosion and climate change, and intensifying desertification, all creating environmental threats and challenges in the region. The MENA region, in addition, has been identified as a climate change hotspot by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, given the expected severe and intense droughts coupled with sea level rise and reduction in precipitation, between 50 and 350 million people in the region will experience increases in water stress. In addition, climate change, jointly with other drivers such as population growth, urbanization, and economic changes, will cause crop failures and consequently large-scale disruption of food system in the MENA region. For example, in Egypt, water supply per capita has dropped 60% since 1970, and it is expected that by 2025, the UN expects Egypt to face absolute water scarcity with 100 million people exposed in the region. In addition to these natural hazards or natural risks, the region faces rigorous lacks in environmental institutions and legal frameworks that are essential to reverse the current state of environmental degradation. Climate change, for example, reveals the institutional inadequacies as mirrored in policy debates on adaptive capacities and climate change resilience. These environmental challenges have been further aggravated by other socio-economic processes which characterize the MENA region and include the huge population growth, rapid urbanization process, and high rate of poverty. In this context, it seems that every time governments in the region are faced with an apparent choice between economic development and jobs on the one hand, and the protection of the environment on the other hand, priority is always given to the former, which is economic development, even at the cost of the status of the environment and people health. So, given these different ecological and economic challenges, environmental activism in the region has always been around issues affecting public health and livelihoods. This was very characteristic to the environmental movements before the Arab Spring. More recently, and following the Arab Spring, environmental activism has been intensifying in the region. In my opinion, the Arab Spring could be described as green spring. And the Arab Spring was not only about toppling down political regimes and changing governments, but also it brought to the forefront of the public sphere environmental issues, and people became more and more concerned with voicing their needs and their environmental claims and right in clean, healthy environment. I would like to give you some concrete examples of environmental movements and campaigns that took place in the region in the wake of the Arab Spring. For example, I will start with the Algerian case study. In Ain Saleh, in the heart of the Algerian Sahara, a collective movement erupted in order to protest against shale gas exploration by the French oil company Total since 2013. The campaign claimed that the Algerian citizens were confronting not only the environmental and health hazards of fracking, but also a form of new colonialism. In this regard, the movement declared that while France has banned Total and other companies from using fracking in its own territory, it is still pushing for it in its former colony Algeria, and for these multinational companies to monopolize exploring and exploiting shale gas in Algeria in the future. 2 years later, the campaign has fostered a formal coalition representing local council. The energy minister was forced to resign, and fracking operations were stalled. I would like to give you another example for another country in North Africa, which is Tunisia. In 2015, an environmental campaign was launched to shut down the country's largest controlled landfill, the landfill of Burj Shakir in the municipality of Sidi Hussein, a 1,000 suburb of Tunis with a number of working-class neighborhoods. The campaign didn't only focus on the compromised health of people living nearby the landfill and hazardous environmental impacts of disposing of waste at it, but also emphasized the rampant corruption in the solid management sector in the country. The campaign exposed the rigged public tendering process, which enabled French company called Bizorno Environment, headed by François Lyotard, to win the contract for the management of the Borj Shakil landfill because of Leotard friendship was ousted President Zain al-Abidin bin Ali. In Morocco, like another North African country, an environmental campaign called We Are Not Trash was formed in the wake of the government decision to import trash from Italy as a cheap alternative to fossil fuel. In particular, the controversy broke out when local media reported that cement firm Lafarge had imported 2,500 tons of Italian rubbish to burn for energy. The campaign managed to make the political corruption hyper-visible by not only investing in the symbolic capital of importing garbage from Italy as a cheap alternative to fuel, but also by insisting on a notion of citizen efficacy, grounded in a collective demand for an inclusive political system and subject to the rule of law. Last but not least, in Egypt, the Egyptian Against Coal campaign was formed in the wake of the Egyptian government decision to lift a long ban on using coal in Egypt. The movement managed to publicize the negative impacts of coal and attract sympathizers and followers. For the environmental activists, the coal trauma is not only connected with adverse environmental and health impacts or entrenched socio-economic injustices, but it is viewed as a battle, or was viewed as a battle to be waged against unsustainable energy resources. Moreover, climate change was found to be perceived as one of the most negative environmental impacts of coal. This finding was particularly interesting as political discussions on the scientific legitimacy of climate change tend to ignore the enormous short-term consequences of relying on fossil fuel, including coal for sure, for the most of energy consumption. It is true that Egypt is committed to the ambitious long-term goal of Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015 to hold the increase in the global average temperature to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, but the government has allowed for the import of coal into Egypt to generate electricity for both industry and households. This means that Egypt would be left stranded with a coal-reliant infrastructure for its energy needs without fulfilling its commitment to reduce CO2 emissions. In addition to this discourse, the anti-coal campaign managed to highlight the deep-rooted socio-economic injustices. For example, while the cement companies get the economic benefits from using coal and exploiting coal as a cheap energy source in their factories, the workers in the factories bear the brunt of using coal, the health and environmental costs. This is one clear example of the socio-economic injustices of using coal. So, after these different examples of environmental movements, I would like to touch up on what these movements tell us about what happens in the region. Despite the different goals and mobilization practices of these different environmental movements, they share a number of features. First, social media played a key role in providing a platform for environmental activists and concerned citizens to voice their views and express their shared grievances. It could be said that the social media spurred a type of alternative communication that doesn't happen through the mainstream media. This alternative communication allows those who are affected, for example, by a polluted river or a cement factory, to share their experience and create their own media content away from the censorship and the control of the state on or over the traditional or the mass media outlets. Second, these movements are far more significant in their political, social, and cultural implication than it might otherwise appear. These movements are not calling for a mere clean environment, Rather, as I mentioned before, these movements express or underlie the people's frustration and discontent with bad governance, low quality of life, corruption, and marginalization. Such movements have a large been a part or have been part of a response to or a rejection of the extreme forms of inequality, particularly social and economic inequality, that have resulted from the shift to neoliberalism, particularly in the MENA region. Therefore, these struggles and their practices can be significant in shaping our understanding how people in the MENA region perceive and relate to their own environment. Third, the significant role of youth in this environmental mobilization reflect their increasing awareness of environmental problems. It also underlies youth agency and willingness to reinforce urgent and ambitious actions as a way to address not only the different environmental controversies in their respective countries, but to contribute to a global dynamic environmental justice movement. This conclusion contrasts with the stereotypical image of youth activists in the MENA region as being empathetic to environmental concerns and adopting like reasonable positions and predictable behavior in relation to activism's expected outcomes. This means that young people are more and more engaged in environmental activism. They are more empowered to assert the environmental rights in the region, and also they are willing to take actions on the ground. Last but not least, the consistent pressure of these movements challenges the discourse of the state and its apparatuses, whereby the economic growth is usually conceptualized as a priority. In this regard, by advocating for environmental causes, the environmental activists managed to challenge established power relations and question a lot of current policies, such as the economic system of corporate capitalism, which is driven by patterns and practices of large-scale capital accumulation and fossil fuel extraction, and its inability to achieve the levels of decarbonization necessary to avoid dangerous irreversible environmental impacts. So I will stop here, and I'm very happy to get your feedback and get the questions, and thank you once more for listening to me.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So now I guess we'll go to the Q&A. So we already have a few questions on it. A reminder that people on Zoom can send us questions on Q&A section, and people on Facebook can just comment on the Facebook Live, and we'll read the questions in here. So we have a first question. I think it's for Hamza, but it can, I think everyone should have, like, everyone has an answer, I think, to this question, or has an idea of an answer. So the question is, how can global resource and power needs be met moving forward, avoiding extractivism? What is the solution? Is it economic system change, participatory policy making, and common ownership of resources? And what role can activism play in this process?
That's a very good question, and I think a complex one at the same time. I think it deserves on its own a whole lecture. I think the point suggested in the question about economic transformation, more democratic and transparent decision-making in natural resource governance and control, all of them are part of the answer. So I think when we talk about alternatives to the current predatory development model, to the current extractivist practices, to the current dispossession and destruction in the region and elsewhere, I think we can take that question and look at it either in the short, medium, and long term. In the long term, for me, the answer is clear. We need We need system change. When we talk about the climate crisis, climate change, ecological crisis, we need system change, which means we need the end of capitalism. Capitalism destroys nature. Capitalism exploits humanity. This is the ill. This is the problem. If we don't address this, it will be just cosmetic changes and nothing is going to change. The same patterns of dispossession would continue, just maybe switching the energy source from oil and gas and coal towards renewables. So this is one element. But in the short to medium term, there are things that you could do. And these things need to be rooted in resistance, in mobilizations, rooted in the struggles of people in the ground, struggles of small-scale farmers, struggles of people who want to protect their land, their natural resources. And Soraya was talking about housing struggles. So all these needs to be connected somehow to represent a kind of a challenge to the system in place. So if I talk in particular about extractivism, for me, it needs that move towards a better alternative or sustainable and just alternatives needs to be a kind of a transition. You cannot stop extracting overnight. This is the reality. Algeria, if you look at Algeria, more than 95% of its export income comes from oil and gas. So you cannot just tell them stop drilling now because because of climate change and the environment. So it needs to move from a predatory extractivism, the current form that we have now, that destroys the environment and do not benefit the local communities, do not benefit the people, do not benefit the unemployed and the poor, towards a more regulated form of extractivism, which means that the externalized social and environmental costs of the oil and gas industry is taken into account, which means more taxes on companies, which means higher prices for those commodities. And then from there, we move towards just the indispensable form of extractivism. We extract what we need. But as you can imagine, this is a really difficult task. It would need, the diversification of the economies away from the extractions of oil and gas. It means, in the case of, let's say, the North African countries or the Maghreb countries, it means regional economic integration that is not subordinate to the dictates of globalization. And at the end, and ultimately, it needs democratization. So how can you put those questions on the table? Let's talk about, the just transition or the transition towards renewable, when people like in Algeria are ruled by a military dictatorship. I don't know if you're aware, Algeria has been witnessing a popular uprising in the last 2 years, asking for a civilian state, not a military state. So those questions, and I think what I tried to demonstrate in my talk, that when we talk about environmental and climate justice, it needs to be linked to questions of socio-economic justice, to questions, to struggles, resisting dispossession, and then at the same time to questions of radical and participatory democracy. At the end of the day, the fight for environmental justice needs to be fundamentally democratic, or it won't be.
Thank you, Hamza. I'll go to the next question, then I'll ask my own questions if you don't mind. So this is a question to Aziza. Do you think that fracking operations have been closed in Algeria only due to the local movement, or the drop in oil prices globally caused shutting down many fracking operations around the world?
Mm-hmm. Very interesting question. Thank you for the question. As my colleague Hamza mentioned, the government was very clever in manipulating the protesters and dividing the protesters by, for example, giving some incentives for them by providing some jobs. And actually by giving such a kind of conciliation, the movement was dissipated by time. However, during the time of the demonstration, the Ain Saleh movement was perceived as a threat to the long-term survival of Bouteflika regime. The government needed shale resources to maintain the current the export level in the long term, and to continue buying social peace by recycling hydrocarbon revenue through social spending and investment. Therefore, I can say that the government was cautious. Usually violence was used to disperse the movement or the protesters. However, at this time, the government managed to have some kind of compromise and conciliation with the protesters in order to avoid having like widespread violence or maybe revolution that topple down other regimes in neighboring countries. So yeah, the answer for this question is that the government managed to divide the protesters and manipulate them by giving some incentives that managed to reduce or contain the protests.
Malek, can I add something to what Aziza has just said about?
Yes.
Yeah, just quickly. So in 2015, when that movement has been dissipated, in a way repressed, violently repressed, and people need to know that people in the Sahara, which is a very hot area in summer period, they have been protesting for 5 months, so from January to May, and that, to be honest, it has been an inspiring movement in Algeria. But then, since then, there has been no transparency about what's happening. If they are drilling, if they are fracking, nobody knew. Just some people or observers said that the government has stopped because of the oil prices going down. It doesn't make sense and so on. But it has come back again in 2019, just before the February uprising. And in 2020, the current president, Tebboune, said Algeria needs to exploit its natural resources, including shale gas and so on. So it is on the table, but nobody knows if it is taking place or not. Yes, I think with the current oil prices, $60, $70 a barrel, I don't think it makes sense for Algeria to invest in that sense. But the Algerian regime, I don't think it just thinks on economic terms. It thinks about its survival, short-termism, continuing to honor its contracts that it has with the European Union, given that in the last decade, there has not been huge discoveries of oil and gas fields in the country. Just an addition to what Aziza has been saying.
Thanks, Hamza. So we have another question that has no, it's directed at anyone, but I think it's a question, it's a very general question, so everyone has something to say about it, I guess. Given that many of the environmental movements and initiatives are rather local and scattered, I wonder how all those movements could better join forces and create a joint narrative. Will this be possible against the backdrop of increasing authoritarianism, repression of opposition movements in the region? If you'd like to answer that question, I think maybe Soraya would like to, if you'd like to answer first, or Aziza.
Yeah, I can. Actually, it's a good question, but I think the real question is it that important to have like a big joint movement? Because as it said, sometimes having a big movement is facing a lot of repression. So it depends of the context. Again, in Morocco, for example, we had the Herak of the Reef, we had Jrada, we had Imid, or even if it was not like a big movement in terms of number, but it has quite a big impact. And after all of that, we had the Ikel Movement, which was really completely structured around the question of land, with a very clear narrative against like the colonial legacy and everything. But I guess it's also important that journalists, activists, researchers also take time to look at very small scale movements and to try to make the link, to map them, for example. That can be a good exercise. So sometimes I guess it's not, we don't have also to ask people to get organized in the big movement, but also we can do as a journalist, again, as an activist, as a researcher, this work of mapping all this kind of movement and see what kind of narrative came across all of them, not only in Morocco, but also across the region. That's for Morocco, because in Tunisia there is several initiatives about a more organized movement about environmental issue.
Aziza?
Yes.
If you'd like me to repeat the question. No, good.
To add something for this question?
Yeah. And if you don't remember it, I can say it again.
Yes, please.
So the question was, given many of the environmental movements and initiatives are rather local and scattered, I wonder how all those movements could better join forces and create a joint narrative. Will this be possible against the backdrop of increased authoritarianism and repression of opposition movements in the region?
Okay. As I mentioned in my presentation, the Arab Spring could be described as a trigger for environmental movements. And given the increasing access to alternative media and social media, activists have more chance to voice their needs and form coalitions and so on. However, we shouldn't forget that the Arab region is characterized by lack of environmental movements in comparison with the West or Western countries. And the increasing studies about environmental movements that took place in post-Arab Spring, very important, given that the fact they are critically reviews the environmental movements in the MENA region, not by paying it lip service or submitting it under the logic of northern movements, but on its own terms. In other words, that we find that NGOs and environmental or NGOs in general or civil society association didn't revise their orientation to include environmental causes to their in their work. In addition, the NGOs in the global north are typically embedded with open political opportunity structure as their exercise practice of free speech is not met with repression by their governments. However, groups in the MENA region or in the global south in general have few resources to work with, being embedded a less responsive or more repressive regime. In this regard, it is worth mentioning that the current uprisings that have been taking place in the regions have not lasting impacts. So I need to be a little more cautious about describing the current situation as less authoritarian. So yeah, I guess it's a huge struggle, and the NGOs in our region are still navigating their own way in order to address with quite restrictive regime, and also with they need to engage more and more in environmental causes and change their orientation and values to not only focus in political demands, but also in environmental demands. So I think it's a long way.
Aziza, I think Julia Shukair Vifotho, which is who's our head of environmental program at ARI, would like to answer this question as well. So I'll leave it to her.
Oh, I would certainly not answer it. I am not an expert on this at all, but I wanted to follow up on something Soraya said and link it to some of the work that we're trying to do at ARI and hear from you. So on the question of mapping activist networks and the role that the researcher can play in doing that, and putting aside kind of some of the implicit assumptions that we have when we ask about mobilization of these issues, we implicitly ask, are they united, or are they, how big are they, or are they working across multiple sectors or across multiple regions? And thinking about the role that the researcher can play in finding those potential commonalities. So that is something we're trying to do in this activity area that is the subject of the talk today at ARI, is precisely mapping these networks. But also my question here, to follow up on Soraya's point, was to bring in the transnational angle. And I'm curious to what extent you're seeing, and this question could be to the three of you, to what extent are you seeing cooperation across countries on some of these issues? Especially, for example, on the issues of garbage dumping that have like a similar actor, like a corporation, a European corporation that affects, multiple regions, multiple countries. Are you seeing transnational cooperation? Should that be a question we should be asking, or should we also be wary about some of the assumptions, as Soraya mentioned? So yeah, I just wanted to bring in that angle. Thank you.
I think maybe Hamza can answer more about the collaboration, the trans-regional collaboration. For as far as I know, there is not a lot of collaboration actually between, between different countries. I guess also the borders, the closing border between Morocco and Algeria are really not helping. That's the first point. And also there were several initiatives. One of them is Hamza initiative in food sovereignty, for example, in North Africa. But I guess, he will answer more that Corona also didn't help this last year to continue this kind of movement. So they were, I think, Hamza, correct me if I'm wrong, since 5 years ago, something like that, collaboration more between Morocco and Tunisia around global issue of pollution and things like that. On garbage specifically, there's nothing, but it's still shy collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Malek, shall I add something? Yeah?
Yeah, you can go ahead, yeah.
No, I think I echo what Soraya has just said about the weak the weak scale of the collaboration in those countries. As a person from the region, I see Morocco and Tunisia as my second countries. To be honest, of course, there are differences, but I consider myself as Tunisian and Moroccan. We are the same people, based on historical, political, and cultural legacies. And the way I approach my work and my activism in the region, I approach it from a regional perspective, because I believe in transnational solidarity. I believe in the possibility of building strong and coherent social movement regionally and at the international scale. There are a lot of examples in the world that we could learn from the African continent to Latin America to Asia. There are movements that are built transfrontal, that goes beyond the borders. And for me, I feel that kind of transnational solidarity brings a lot of learned experiences and lessons, and could be an opportunity to strategize together, to avoid the same mistakes that have been committed here and there. Of course, we need to take into account the differences and the specific characteristics of each region and each country. I think there has been some collaboration on other issues related mainly to anti-globalization struggles in the region. I think Tunisia and Morocco, yes, a lot of activists and organizations have been working on that since the early 2000s. But when it comes to environmental questions, there are initiatives here and there about caravans of solidarity, trying to connect activists and leaders from different social movements in the region. Soraya mentioned the North African Food Sovereignty Network, which is an initiative in its first steps, trying to push forward a food sovereignty agenda in the region. Yeah, but these always confront huge difficulties. Among them, authoritarianism, repression, and also there is, as Soraya was saying, the border between Algeria and Morocco, and other difficulties as well. So for me, as an idealist, I believe it is possible, and we need to do more by emphasizing the voices of those struggles and try to connect them with other social movements wherever possible. I think it is doable, and for me, it is desirable. It should be. So people should learn from the mistakes of others. People should build together, because the problem is systemic and global, and we need to connect the dots between various issues, not just the environment and the climate, but as well on questions of land and natural resources, food sovereignty, trade justice. And I think the constructions of such discourses that are anti-colonial, anti-patriarchal, anti-racist would open, the way and the horizon for more building on various issues.
Can I add something in this regard?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, regarding like the transboundary like activism or national like cooperation among different NGOs or different groups of activists in the country, in the MENA countries, I guess, as Hamza mentioned, it's very important, it's very desirable, given the fact that the environmental problems are transboundaries and its impacts or their impacts are felt among different countries, not only in a specific country. However, the success of having such a kind of cooperation among different activist groups in the MENA region is related to different factors. First of all, the normative power of such a kind of groups is often in tandem with like the democratic, the political systems available or prevailing in these countries. Second, the target state's domestic political social structure mediate the impact of the environmental norms advocated by the different activism groups. The third factor is that these activist groups form alliance with national and local NGOs to force state governments to give political and financial support for different activist groups, and this is kind of very challenging situation and need a lot of work. So as I mentioned, it's very desirable. However, we still have a lot to do as at the formal level and informal level.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left and a bunch of questions to be answered. So we have a question on NGOs, on allyship, actually, that includes NGOs. So for you, which are the current or potential allies for local environmental movements in the region? So would it be political movements, unions, NGOs, some parts of the government, international counterparts, or I don't know, larger movements or political parties? Do you think what kind of alliances can be built at the transnational level, but also at the national level? If any of you wants to answer that question. No?
Would you please repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so what kind of alliances do you think local environmental movements can build? I think transnationally, but also within the country, a certain country, say like political parties, unions, NGOs, ministries, is there alliances that can be built at the local level?
Yeah, for example, I can answer this question, give my own input. Yes. For example, in the Egyptian case study, the Anti-Coal movement in Egypt, the environmental activists build an alliance with like different NGOs that are concerned with the environment in Egypt. And also there was a coalition with like among the environmental activists and public figures, such as like university professors or media players. And as I mentioned, like the formal efforts, like for example, we have in Egypt like political Green Party. However, and it was kind of shocking that the political Green Party in Egypt didn't play a significant role in advocating for preventing coal imports to Egypt. So usually it's kind of paradox why the Green Party should advocate for environmental causes, however, didn't play any significant role in advocating or in building an alliance with environmental activists who wanted to prevent the coal imports to Egypt. In Egypt, as I mentioned, there was a coalition between the environmental activists, like public media figures, university professors, and also lay citizens and local communities who were mostly impacted by the cement factories and using coal.
Thank you. We have a question on corruption as well. So it's addressed to everyone. Corruption and governance are both critical issues at the government side. To what extent these two issues are affecting local activism? And I think here we can definitely link the question with the question of landfills and garbage importation.
Okay, I can give my own input on this if it's okay to start with me.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I would like to give you like an example about like how corruption penetrate, like for example, the waste management sector in Tunisia and also in Lebanon as a country in the MENA region. As I mentioned in my presentation, the movement against waste management in Tunisia didn't only highlight the health and environmental impacts of trash being disposed nearby local communities and households and so on, but also it highlighted the rigged contracting process that gave the contract to collect and dispose garbage to Italian company, the company that is owned by one of the friends of the ousted Tunisian president Zinedine Ben Ali. This is one example of corruption. And the second one in Lebanon, where the youth tank movement erupted in 2015. And the movement also didn't only focus on the health and environmental impacts of trash being uncontrolled or uncollected from the streets of Beirut, but also it highlighted the corrupted waste management sectors and how like the companies called Asaqalin that is owned by by Saad Al-Hariri is controlling the collection of the garbage and how corrupted the way of granting contracts to companies that collect manage is. And this, as I mentioned, the environmental movements is not only about the right in clean and healthy environment, but also the environmental movements in the region, for example, in Tunisia and in Lebanon, highlight the corrupted regime and the sectarian, in the case of Lebanon, the sectarian political system and the corrupted regime, where the basic service are like the state is unable to meet the basic service of for the citizens, to provide the basic service for the citizens due to the corruption of the whole political system.
Malek, can I add something on this?
Sure, sure.
Or maybe Soraya wants to go first. Okay. I think I'll comment first on the question of the garbage disposal and its exports towards the peripheries, the countries on the peripheries. I think we need to look at that question in the framework of environmental racism, because those companies and those ruling elites, in complicity, of course, with elites, local, domestic and local elites, are considering those people are disposable themselves. It's the surplus of humanity. And when you see the European Union letting people die in the Mediterranean and not accepting people to its territories, yeah, so this is the surplus of humanity, the disposable of humanity. So just throw rubbish and shit in their territories and that's fine. And as well as it needs to be seen as part of an economic system that has always worked through the externalization of costs. When I talk about the externalization of costs, it means always make the social environmental costs on the burdens of the poorest. And the poorest can happen to be in countries in the global north. So the question of environmental racism and environmental justice actually came through the environmental movements in the 70s and 80s in the US itself, from Black communities saying, why are you dumping those poisons and those factories in our communities? So we need to see those issues through, I think, those angles. When it comes to corruption, yes, corruption is a problem. Corruption is a problem in the West as well. It's just legalized corruption. But there is a tendency to talk about corruption as if, those countries or those elites in the global South are all corrupt. Let's just deal with corruption and then we'll resolve the problem. No, multinationals and corporations are much more corrupt. Who does the corrupting? Who bribes those elites? Who accepts that system? Corruption is just a symptom of a system that is built on plundering and dispossessing people, and they do it whatever the cost, through corruption, through supporting brutal dictatorships and repressive regimes. That's how it always has been. The question of alliances. I'm up for alliances. We have to have alliances and build the global movements, and there are a lot of efforts towards that. The climate justice movement has been building for more than 20 years, and I have been involved in that movement, trying to connect, the North African regions and the people of the regions to those discussions. But I feel those alliances need to come as well with respect and some understanding of the local realities, because I remember in 2015 when the Ain Saleh anti-fracking uprising erupted, most of the European NGOs considered it as purely environmental and nothing has to do with the economic marginalization, the dictatorships that those countries are living. So those questions need to be understood, that those people are resisting a political and economic system, not only in their own countries, but globally. Because it's the European countries, the European multinationals that come to our lands and extract those resources and destroy those environments, of course, with the complicity of the local elites. So yes, we need transnational solidarities and we need to build them, but then they need to be diversified. Unions are part of it. Grassroots groups are part of it. NGOs are part of it. But NGOs as well, it's not all white and black. Most of them actually have an agenda of depoliticizing the struggle, trying to frame them in a way that weaken the movements. And this is, and actually a lot of people have been talking about the NGOization of the world. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I think it's a bad thing, but not all NGOs are bad. So these are just a few thoughts. I think it needs a lot of time to develop those reflections, but maybe Soraya could continue on this. I don't know.
We don't have a lot of time, but just to add on that, I guess again that it's also very linked to a big structure movement and a small scale one. And it's true that we have the tendency to think that like small-scale movements, the problem is that they are more easily corrupted than biggest one, which, to be honest, I doubt, because biggest movement also can face, as Hamza said, a lot of problem with NGOization and everything, and they have contact with other kind of partners, like foreign partners, or even times even the European Union or everything. So I guess it depends what we call corruption, but it's true that the big movement or the structured one, they have they can have like this structured narrative, but most of the time their agenda are very linked to the agenda of people who are giving money at the end. So, and that's something that we don't see in more small movements, but it's true also that small movements, they are, for example, in Morocco, easily silenced also through very local negotiation with local elite, for example, for election or things like that. So I don't know. I think it's a very big question that's actually quite difficult to answer.
Thank you. I have we're gonna run a bit late because we have a few questions really that seem really interesting. So related to that, we have a question on how to deal with co-opted NGOs, and more generally speaking, what we were just mentioning a few minutes ago, the NGOization of struggles in the region. I think this is the case for most of the countries, but specifically countries where democratization has opened the way, has led the way for NGOization. So if any of you wants to answer this.
I guess in that the comparison between Morocco and Tunisia can be really interesting, because the NGOization of the Moroccan scene is quite old now. It's it started at the beginning in 2000, quite right after the reign of the actual king Mohammed VI, with an explosion of NGO. And in 2011, for example, that NGOization played quite an important role between building a movement. So in 2011, like in all the region, there were a movement called 20 February movement, 20 February movement in Morocco, that asked for a democracy, basically. But another part, the movement was divided in two. One part of the movement was really about asking for democracy and constitutional change, or really like about democratic rights. And the other part of the movement was really more focused on social demand, social rights and everything. And it was quite obvious in 2011 that all the scene was pushing for and only for having only a democratic movement, and to not include social demand, and to not include, for example, slogans around dignity or around social justice. We're very it's very it's really the NGO scene very again close to foreign foundation, for example, that has been working for years and years and decades in Morocco for democratization. And we can see that specifically, for example, for land issue, because there was this movement, Soulaliet, so the movement for the right to women to be compensated in the case of privatization of land. And this movement was really structured around a feminist NGO, ADFM, l'Association démocratique des femmes marocaines. And this movement was not, for example, addressing at all the core of the problem, which is the privatization of common land, or for example, why we are still having a colonial tenor of collective land, why it's the Ministry of the Interior who is owner of collective land and not the owner and not the inhabitant. This movement was only focused on gender equality. And it's very interesting to see that even if they did quite a good job now, for example, women can be compensated in case of privatization of land. So that's good. But we can see that there was not like a very radical critique on land grabbing or also on how the state is acting like a facilitator for private investor to land grab the land of the tribe. And it's interesting to see that in 2018, I'm lost with numbers in English, and 18, when the Ikel movement was quite strong, actually the ADFM and the Soulaliet movement was not part of this movement of the land, you know, and because it was a complete other network, completely not linked also to this kind of NGO, even if, as Hamza said, it was structured by a lot of very small and local NGO in the Amazigh society, so Berber, as people said, even if I don't like this word. So yeah, I guess it's interesting also to see that everything that happened in Morocco it's happening now in Tunisia, of course, in a completely other context, but it's interesting to see like how all this youth of 2011 is now more and more structured by NGOs, and how it influences or not their way of claiming, for example.
If anyone else would like to add something, otherwise, I'll just close the.
I can add if
the panel.
If maybe Aziza wants to add first. I don't know.
Just I would like to add very very short follow-up comment about what Soraya just mentioned. For example, in Egypt, there are some environmental NGOs that advocate for the interest of economic interests, for example, and they have very distorted perception of what sustainability means. And this could be justified in given the fact that multiple NGOs in Egypt didn't have some kind of like values changes, didn't like include environmental causes in their work along the last few years. Therefore, they have kind of distorted perception of what sustainability means. For example, I had some interviews with people or environmental activists who used to work with NGOs, and I was surprised that they have this perception of green economy, that it's okay to explore the natural resources and to accelerate the extraction of the natural resources as long as the people are getting some economic benefits. Therefore, this, like as I mentioned, like shortened perception of sustainability is a barrier to the efficient work of NGOs in Egypt. Furthermore, given the changing political situation in the countries, in the MENA countries, in the wake of the Arab Spring, for example, after the Egyptian revolution, there was kind of state vacuum, and the NGOs had more freedom to engage in civic work in order to fill the vacuum that resulted from the revolution. However, after the political regimes were changed and less political opportunities were there, the NGOs' work was restricted. Furthermore, as I mentioned before, there's some kind of usually when we talk about NGOs in the global south or in the MENA region, we assume that such a kind of NGOs are working in the same conditions that are available or prevailing in the global north. However, it's completely different political and social situations. These NGOs have their own challenges, and as I mentioned, there's a difference between how they approach environmental causes. This difference is usually also related to how they perceive and relate to sustainability and how they define environmental sustainability. And this was a concrete case study or a concrete information I found when I used to do my interviews with some environmental activists.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to close because the interpreter that we would really like to thank is tired, very understandably so. So thank you very much, Hamza, Aziza, and Soraya for joining us at this conference. It was really enlightening and very interesting. So we're really very happy to launch our new environmental program with this conference, and we hope to see you engage with us in future events as we deepen our work on these issues. So for the audience, the conference continues tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central European time with 2 panels. So we have environmentalism from below, local politics and global challenges, and environment in conflict, ecologies of war and occupation. Again, thank you. Thanks to everyone who joined us. And thanks for Nassim Barakat for interpreting this conference. And we hope to see you very soon.